So when we say a country X, so they say a country X is rising or country X is declining, what do we really mean? So what do we mean by country X? And what benchmarks do we use to measure whether a country is rising or declining, right? And what do we measure the oldness of a country? So where does this country, this concept of, say, China, or this concept of the US begin, right? So the temporal boundaries of the identity. And in the sense, it's the construction of we as a nation. So I have listed some categories. And here, I mean, these categories on the vertical column, you can go on, you can add different, criteria to assess the oldness of the, the identity of the country. And here I just listed some of the more prominent ones that we used to talk about to discuss the features of a country. And if you go by, say, territory, the US is the New World. It was a British colony. And like the US, Australia was a British colony. And China, in terms of its territory now, was before the modern China, there was the imperial China. And Turkey, it was the Ottoman Empire. And if you talk about the country in terms of civilization, then the US and Australia is debatable whether they were part of the European civilization, and of course they revised the European civilization after they got independence. And China, there is a Chinese civilization arguably still going on and still alive. And Turkey, is Turkey Islamic civilization, or was become more secular, or over the years? So, I mean, all those things are quite not very straightforward, right? And if you talk about the continuity in terms of its ethnicity, ethnic linguistic continuities, then the US, Australian, they were not the natives, right? So the US, the arrival of the Europeans, but then they removed the Native Americans, and the same story could be said in Australia, right? The removal of the indigenous Australians and the removal of Native Americans because of the westward expansion movement. And in China, some dynasties of imperial China were ruled by the Han Chinese, but the dynasties like the Yuan dynasty and the Qing dynasty were ruled by ethnic minorities. They were non-Han Chinese. And in terms of Turkey, is Turkey still a part? Can we equate Turkey with Ottoman Empire? Is Turkey a continuity of Ottoman Empire? And in terms of political structure, probably that is the least ambiguous category. So the US was founded in 1776, Australia in early 20th century, and surprisingly, China as a nation state and Turkey as a nation state, they were actually younger than the US, Australia, right? China, the People's Republic of China, the current political structure as a nation state, only got established in 1949 by the CCP, and the Turkey was in after the First World War. The First World War, that was 1923. So the purpose of me presenting this table to you is to show that, when we talk about it, we use this country X of, say, China. China is rising, China is declining, China is re-emerging. All those statements we make, they're actually not as straightforward. They can be problematized. And the way, when we say a China is rising or declining, maybe we should think more carefully, is like which type China we're talking about, right? So when we say China is rising, what do we mean by that? And what benchmark do we use? So, and I think it's really, what really matters is the narrative that we account for a country, say China, and China is rising. That is a narrative. So in my PhD dissertation, I use narrative analysis to examine the narratives. So what do I mean by narrative? Basically, they are stories. A story is about a country's identity. Now here, but because that is a long story, so, and it's not directly related to today's debate, so I'm going to skip that part and just pick up some of the points that I think are more important and more relatable to what we're going to discuss later. And the question that I'm really interested in exploring in my thesis is this declined civilization ever rise again. And I examined this in the context of a modern international system. So in the sense I examined it from a time frame in the 19th century onwards and in the modern international system. I'm not a historian, so my research isn't really a historical account. I'm not examining, like time by examining the rise and decline of civilizations. I had 26 cases. I'm not a historian, so my research is really not a historical explanation. My research is also not a speculation, so I don't really make a speculative analysis for, say, whether a declined civilization can really reemerge, resurrect. So what I do instead is I explain the logic of civilizational decline in the modern world, in the sense, like, like Hegel, his philosophy of history. So Hegel isn't interested in history. Is not a matter of days or the battles and the events, right? He's not interested in explaining those the history that our conventional understanding of history, like history as those days and the events and the wars. He's more interested in the history of the logic, so the philosophy of history. So what I did, my research is similar to the Hegel's theorization of his philosophy explanation for history. So I'm more interested in explaining the logic, the patterns, the underlying logic behind these changes. And the key of my explanation of my theory is really the concept of temporality. So temporality, this may sound a bit foreign to most of you who are not who don't really know about this concept. Put it simply, temporality is really examines the relationship between the temporal dimensions, like the past, the present, and the future. So there are three major temporal dimensions that makes a unit holistic, right? So like say I'm a being, like a human being. So my past, my present, and my future, our being, our very existence always constitutes these three dimensions. So we can know my presence because I know there was like a past and the future. So I use temporality as the concept of temporality as a heuristic for the development of my theory. And my central argument is civilizations are fragile in the sense that the resurrection of a declined civilization is not a possibility in the modern world. That is, a declined civilization declined forever. And the implications of my research is, okay, this is the part that is relevant to today's discussion, is countries like China, pre-modern empire, pre-modern civilization, China is rising materially again in the 21st century. So, and China has developed this aspiration, this political aspiration collectively of re-emergence. So in the Chinese narrative, it's like 中华民族伟大复兴, right? The great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. So that is one direct implication for the empirical analysis. Okay. So let me talk about my reasoning, right? The theory. So modernity as the temporality is my starting point of my analysis. So what do I mean by modernity as the temporality? So to quote Polish sociologist and philosopher Zygmunt Bauman, he said that modernity is a prevailing consciousness of order as a task. Time itself was one of the main objects of the modern ordering consciousness. The preoccupation with time, the hegemonic status of the narrative of progress. The narrative of progress was the only tale that time deemed worthy of being modern. So there seems to be this linear logic of progression. So societies and states always progress in a linear fashion. They're always moving forward. And any other sub-narrative that doesn't subscribe to this temporality of modernity are considered as a pre-modern or just illegitimate. So this modernity as a temporality itself really dominate and homogenize the world order. So when modernity become universalized due to colonialism and globalization subsequently, our world, although our world as a globe is a space, but this space is a temporalized space. So there's always this more advanced advanced economies, advanced cultures, and this is hierarchy, temporal hierarchies within the current social world space. And the temporal orientation of the modern world, if you have to give a direction, that is forward-looking. So this notion of we're always moving, progressing forwardly, right? So that this is like moving forward. But the temporal orientation of civilization resurrection, that is to restore a declined or past or former civilization. That's what I call a civilization resurrection. Is what is on the other, I mean, the direction is the opposite direction. It's moving along an opposite direction that is backward looking. So I highlight this very contradiction between the temporal orientation of modernity and the temporal orientation of the idea of to restore a civilization. There's an inherent contradiction there. And when applying my reasoning to the empirical analysis, I examined 3 empirical cases. They are China and Japan, the US. I examined the narratives of identity construction in the context. So I am not looking at the specific historical cases. I'm not doing a, like the case, like a process tracing case analysis. Rather, what I'm interested in is the narratives these countries tell you. And the summary of my analysis is really that the resurrection of civilization is not a possibility. Why? Because first of all, there's a living history effect. So what do I mean by living history effect? So for instance, Japan, right? Japan was before the Meiji Restoration. So pre-modern Japan was an imitator of the Chinese civilization to a large extent, right? They learned from, they inherited the Chinese political, social, and cultural institutions. And of course, there were moderations, right? That Japan actually moderated the Chinese civilizations. But still, they learned a lot from the Chinese civilization. So in a sense, and they acknowledged they were the imitator. So the imitators, they quickly abandoned China. So, in the Meiji, Japan said we need to leave Asia and join Europe. So they quickly abandoned the system and start to modernize, to learn from the West. And the US, in a sense, also living history, because although the founding members of the modern United States were Anglo-Saxons from England, the British, Irish, they brought European civilizations and political institutions to North America and established the colonies there. But once they got independent, they kind of revised what they inherited from the British, and they made something unique, right? And the very idea to move forward and to get rid of history, seeing history as a burden, that very conception of seeing history as a burden is something that I would like to highlight here, is this living history effect. So that living history effects demonstrate how vulnerable and quickly a civilization can dissolve once there is something, there's the opportunity, whether it's like American, they left the European continent and they moved to a new world, right? To establish, there's a chance for them to establish the new institutions and out there. Or in case of Japan, they didn't have to move to a different continent, but yet they have decided to live history. So there's this effect, which means the restoration of a civilization is challenged by the notion, by the living history effect. And also, there's internalization and socialization because modernity is such a prevalent and hegemonic temporality. So basically, no nation states has escaped this temporal ordering of modernity. So, and in this case, China as the embodiment, the very embodiment of Chinese civilization, they developed linear national history. So therefore, we just lumped all the Chinese dynasties into one single coherent narrative. They call it Chinese history. And that's what I mean by the linear national histories. Of course, say Ming wouldn't regard the Yuan, the Mongols as the ancestors. They wouldn't do that. So dynasties, before the modern China was born, the dynasty wouldn't read the Chinese history in that fashion, but it's only the modern China when have this idea of national consciousness developed, they start to write and practice history in that way. And there's an internalization of temporal ordering of modernity, the idea of progress, idea of backward, we need to catch up with the West. That is a socialization that China had, that's how China socialized into the modern world. And by these two mechanisms, there's no way that the restoration of civilization is a possibility. So in conclusion, in my opinion, that reemergence, say China, the reemergence of China, what does it mean? It's not just China rise again as a material, powerful country, but rather the restoration of the Chinese civilization. So in that sense, it's a mirage. And the reemergence can be a matter of choice because there were other great powers, empires, kingdoms of great powers. Say the rest of when the US was rising, they didn't seek to restore to reemerge. When Russia was rising to great power status, Russia didn't seek to reemerge. Of course, now Russia is declining, and there is this narrative of resurgence in Russia today. But when Russia was rising to a great power status, it didn't have this aspiration. So reemergence is really a matter of choice. And the next question I think is worth of exploring is really whether a country should live in or leave in history.